Good afternoon, everyone. This is Administrative Law Judge Molly McBride. As you know, the hearing is scheduled to begin at noon today. I see that we still have some people signing in, so I'm going to wait a couple more minutes to give people a little more time to log in. I appreciate your patience. We should start in just a couple more minutes. I want to give people a few more minutes to log in. Thank you. Good afternoon to anyone who's just joined us. This is Administrative Law Judge Molly McBride. We are scheduled to begin the hearing at noon, but we've had a few people who are still logging in, so we're going to wait a few more minutes to allow people to log in. Thank you for your patience. We'll begin the hearing shortly. Good afternoon, this is Molly McBride. If the court reporter is ready, we're going to get started.
Okay, one moment. I have us on the record.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Molly McBride, and I'm an administrative law judge with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. I will be presiding over today's public comment hearing to receive public input on the draft disadvantaged communities criteria. We have closed captioning available today in English as well as other languages. There is a slide on the screen with instructions on how to use the closed captioning. If you would like to use it and you've joined us today by the internet, you will see a small box on the left side of your screen with the letter CC. If you click on that box, you'll have access to the closed captioning that we have available here today. On behalf of the DEC and NYSERDA, I would like to thank you for joining us at this hearing and for participating in this important process. The DEC, in partnership with the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, also known as NYSERDA, scheduled 11 public hearings to be held across New York State to receive public input on the draft disadvantaged communities criteria and to advance the finalization of the criteria to help guide the implementation of the state's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. Today is the last of the 11 hearings. New York's Climate Justice Working Group, which consists of representatives from environmental justice groups across the state, as well as New York State agency representatives, voted in December to release the draft criteria for identifying the disadvantaged communities in order to allow public review of the criteria. The draft disadvantaged communities criteria public comment period commenced in March with a 120-day public comment period. That public comment period ends on July 7th, 2022. The draft disadvantaged communities criteria can be found at climate.ny.gov. Again, that website is climate.ny.gov. The criteria are based on geographic, public health, environmental hazard, and socioeconomic factors, and once approved, will be used to help meet the directives of the Climate Act related to reducing pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, as well as to inform regulatory impact statements and the state's clean energy and energy efficiency criteria. Notice of this hearing was published in the department's environmental notice bulletin on May 4th, 2022. Assisting us today with this hearing are members of DEC's Office of Communication Services, and we thank them for their help here today. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Alana Cadell-Tucky, who is the director of the DEC's Office of Environmental Justice, who will give a brief overview of the work to date and the draft criteria. As indicated, the purpose of today's public comment hearing is to allow members of the public to comment on the draft criteria. Today is not a question and answer session. Written comments must be submitted by July 7th, 2022 to be considered. Comments submitted by email should be received by the department by 5 p.m. on July 7th to be considered, and comments submitted by mail should be postmarked by July 7th, 2022. Equal weight is given to written and oral comments. In a moment, I will read the email address and the mailing address if you would like to submit written comments. For those of you who are attending today over the internet, we have the information on the screen on how to submit written comments. Anyone who wishes to speak today was asked to register, and I'll call the registered speakers in the order in which they registered. As indicated in the notice, we would ask that each speaker try to limit their comments to 2 minutes. We will call your name when it is your turn to speak, and at that time, we will unmute your line. If you have attended by telephone and we call your name, we'll ask you to press *3 on your phone to raise your hand, and then we will know to unmute your line. If anyone is having any technical issues today, please call area code 518-402-8044. We have someone who is standing by who can help you. Again, that's 518-402-8044. When we do call your name and unmute your line, I ask that you please speak loudly, slowly, and clearly. We do have a court reporter who's making a record of today's hearings, and we'd like to make sure that we have an accurate record of your comments. Before I begin the speakers, I'd like to introduce Alana Cadell-Tucky from the DEC to give a brief presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alana Cadell-Tucky, and I'm the director of the Office of Environmental Justice at the Department of Environmental Conservation. I'm also the chair for the Climate Justice Working Group. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this public hearing on the draft Disadvantaged Communities criteria. The Climate Act, or the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, is the nation's most ambitious climate change-related legislation. Its goal to reduce New York's greenhouse gas emissions from all human activities by 100% over 1990 levels by the year 2050, with an incremental target of at least 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by the year 2030. At least 85% of the reductions by 2050 must come from preventing the release of greenhouse gases. Implementing the Climate Act will create opportunities to create a better future. To ensure this work also advances climate justice, the Climate Act mandates that at least between 35 to 40% of all benefits of New York State spending on clean energy accrue in disadvantaged communities. State agencies are also required to prioritize greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutant reductions in disadvantaged communities, and this includes the DEC in the drafting of regulations to meet greenhouse gas emission limits that are required by the Climate Act. The identification and prioritization of disadvantaged communities in accounting for the benefits of cutting pollution and improving resilience is what makes our Climate Act such a transformative law. To identify disadvantaged communities in New York, the Climate Justice Working Group was guided by the language in the Climate Act in identifying disproportionately burdened communities. They voted to include 45 indicators using data on environmental hazards, climate change risks, public health issues, geography, and socioeconomic factors like race, income, education levels, unemployment rates, and housing conditions. Additionally, the draft disadvantaged communities designations are reflective of the working group, their lived experiences, and the lived experiences of the residents of these historically overburdened and underfunded communities. Each census tract is scored on a relative burden, risk, vulnerability, or sensitivity. Specifically, the percentile ranks of the indicators used for the census tracts are combined to produce a value that measures the census tract's relative level of environmental burdens and climate change risks, as well as population characteristics and health vulnerabilities relative to other tracts. So tracts with higher scores relative to other tracts in the state or by their region are identified as disadvantaged communities. The working group also voted to include low-income households with incomes at 60% of the state median income as disadvantaged communities or as disadvantaged for the purposes of benefits and investments. So based on the criteria, 44% of households within Western New York fall within the disadvantaged communities criteria. 25% of those households are found in what we consider to be geographic disadvantaged communities. Thank you.
Alana, before we begin with the comments, I just want to read off the address for submitting written comments. We have both an email address and a mailing address, and we have a few people that have joined us by phone, so I want to read those addresses. Anyone that's joined us by the internet will have those addresses on the screen now on the slide, but if you've joined us by phone, the email address for the submission of written comments is daccomments@dec.ny.gov. That's daccomments@dec.ny.gov. And if you'd like to submit comments by mail, it's New York State DEC, draft DAC comments, attention Office of Environmental Justice. So again, that's the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, attention Office of Environmental Justice, 625 Broadway, 14th floor, Albany, New York, 12233. And as a reminder, the deadline for the submission of written comments is July 7th, 2022. So I'm now going to begin calling our speakers. Again, if you've joined us by phone and I call your name, please press *3 on your phone to raise your hand, and then we'll know to unmute your line. If you have signed in by the internet and are using another name, if you've joined with anyone else and we call your name, then please raise your hand so that we know to unmute your line. So I'll start with our first registered speaker is Catherine Landis. If Catherine Landis has joined us, could she please raise her hand by pressing *3 on the telephone? Catherine Landis. Okay, don't see any raised hand. I will call Catherine again in a few minutes. The next registered speaker we have is Neil Patterson. If Neil Patterson is in attendance today, I would ask that he please press *3 on his telephone to raise his hand, or if he's joined by the internet and has logged in with someone else and a different name than his own, please raise your hand and we will know to unmute your line. Neil Patterson. Okay, I will note that I do not have any raised hand right now for Neil Patterson. I will go on to our next speaker. The next registered speaker is Leah Dunn. Leah Dunn, if you have joined us today, please press *3 on your telephone line and we will unmute you. Leah Dunn. If you've joined us by phone, please press *3 on your phone and we will know to unmute your line. Okay, I'll note that I don't have any raised hands yet, but we have had a few callers who just logged in. So I'm going to go back to some earlier people I called. I'm going to again call Catherine Landis. If Catherine Landis has joined us, please press *3 on your telephone and we will know to unmute your line for you to make your comment. Catherine Landis, if you've joined us by phone, please press *3 on your phone and we'll know to unmute your line. Okay, I'll note that no one has raised their hand yet. Neil Patterson. Neil Patterson, if you've joined us by phone, please press *3 on your phone and we'll unmute your line. Okay. I'll go on to our next registered speaker, who is Evan Noor. Evan Noor, if you've joined us here today by phone, please press *3 on your phone to unmute. We will know to unmute your line. Evan Noor. Okay, don't have any raised hand yet for Mr. Noor. Our next registered speaker, who is not on our list of people in attendance, maybe Emily Palumbo. We have one Emily without a last name. If we could unmute that line, we'll see if that's Miss Palumbo. Do we have Emily Palumbo? Your hand is raised. There we go. Go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Emily Columbus. Thank you so much for taking the time to do these public hearings. It's extremely important and allowing us to speak on them. I've worked in government for over 20 years, and I'm currently a grant writer. And the concerns that I have, and of course, there's always a number of different concerns when something comes up, such as changing such a definition with so many variables, is that the agencies be cognizant of the title, such as, disadvantaged communities, and that as people use that wording across different agencies, across local, state, and federal government, that once there is variables identified to create that definition, that it is consistently used. Because what I'm seeing is that people are having to come up with, because there isn't a definition yet, there are temporary definitions that are out there for what disadvantaged communities means right now. Similar to previous similar definitions, such as like an environmental justice area or an opportunity zone. What would be difficult is if someone's designated a disadvantaged community and then that changes, it gets very confusing for funding. Also, I think upstate New York needs to be certainly considered, particularly based on the idea that and the recognition within the guidance that there are very few rural areas, and those rural areas that qualify as DACs, a lot have to do with their inability to have concentrated population due to the number of lakes, the fact that the land is dedicated to food production, and those should be considered as variables as well. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate the work that's being put into this, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Excuse me, this is the court reporter. Can I get the spelling of your last name, please?
Yes, of course. P as in Peter, ALUMBOS as in Sam.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you, Ms. Columbus. Our next speaker is Amy Wittriall. If we could unmute Ms. Wittriall's line. Go ahead, Ms. Wittriall. Go right ahead.
Because of the one of the panelists for today, I'm doing some last minute editing to make sure I comply with DEC's ex parte rules. So I'm wondering if you can come back to me after the rest of the speakers.
Sure. I'll call you again in a few minutes.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Gloria Boyce Charles. Go ahead, you've been unmuted.
Okay, thank you so much for this opportunity to share some thoughts that I have. I'm Gloria Boyce Charles, and I've resided in the Southeast Queens community since 1975. And I've always played an active role in addressing our quality of life issues. I'm a member of the Eastern Queens Alliance. It's a not-for-profit federation of Southeast Queens civics. And I know that that organization is going to be submitting some written comments directly shortly. But my comments today are solely on my own behalf. And they really pertain mostly to, really entirely to the public comment periods for the CLCPA analysis and documentation. The public comment periods for both the scoping plan and the disadvantaged communities criteria document are about to expire, but it's my understanding that public participation in the comment process, in particular, for the in particular, for the disadvantaged community criteria, it's been low. And this is likely because of many people at grassroots levels in some of the most impacted communities, especially in Southeast Queens, are just now becoming aware of this initiative. And very little really has been done on the part of the lead agencies for this effort to advise and engage and educate environmental justice communities. As I said again, especially those in Southeast Queens. So I'm appealing to the leadership within this initiative to rethink their strategy and their timelines for accepting comments on both the scoping plan and the disadvantaged communities criteria documents. But equally importantly, I'm asking that you implement an aggressive plan to communicate and to educate and to engage communities and grassroots organizations. I'm aware that you've already issued a draft scoping plan extension. But without that education and that outreach, people really are scrambling to understand these extensive documents. And so there's more time needed. And without revising your project plan accordingly, which I know this is going to require, what will happen is your results will not be as effective as you would want them to be. And it's not going to address the environmental justice issues that you're tasked to address. And when it comes to the issue of climate change, that's an existential threat to us all. And I don't think that any of us want such outcomes. So thank you for your consideration and your patience in my response. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Boyce Charles. I'm going to recall some speakers that we called earlier that weren't on yet. And if you have joined us today by phone and I call your name, I'm going to remind you that I would ask you to press *3 on your phone to raise your hand, and we'll know to unmute your line for you to make a comment. I'm going to recall Catherine Landis. If Catherine Landis has joined us, please raise your hand by pressing *3 on your phone and we'll unmute your line. Catherine Landis. Okay, I'll move on to the next registered speaker. If Neil Patterson has joined us. Neil Patterson, if you've joined us, please press *3 on your phone to raise your hand and we'll know to unmute your line. Neil Patterson. I don't have any raised hands yet. I will go on to the next registered speaker. We have Leah Dunn. Leah Dunn, if you joined us by phone, please press *3 on your phone and we'll unmute your line. Leah Dunn. Evan Noor. If Evan Noor has joined us, please press *3 on your phone and we'll unmute your line for you to make your comment. Evan Noor. All right, I'm going to go back and recall Miss Wittriall. We'll see if Miss Wittriall is ready to make her comment. Amy Wittriall, are you ready to make your comment at this time? We'll unmute your line. Go ahead.
Yes, Judge McBride. I'll do the best I can. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Well, if you could get a little closer to your phone, I think that would help the court reporter.
Okay, I'm on a desktop. Is this better?
Yes, thank you.
For whatever reason, the Climate Justice Working Group membership and recommendations seem acutely biased in favor of New York City and go to great lengths to give little attention to Western New York, Buffalo, and especially Niagara Falls. This is made worse by the fact that Covanta, whose Niagara Falls incinerator emits nearly double the amount of carbon dioxide versus all Title V smokestacks in Erie County combined, has a seat on the Waste Industry Advisory Council. Waste Management, the other towering polluter in Western New York, also has a seat on the Waste Advisory Council. The Climate Justice Working Group has 2 members from the Adirondacks and no one west of Syracuse, but in representing rural New York. But Western New York has 1 urban member in Buffalo. We're not aware of any expert on competition and incentives independent of the waste industry on the Climate Justice Working Group or the Waste Advisory Council to the Climate Action Council. Add to this the fact that the underlying percentiles and methods for common sizing emissions data for percentiles provided by DEC staff to the Climate Justice Working Group is confidential, a secret to the group, and a secret to the public. DEC issued an extensive hazardous waste plan and maintains its own extensive hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facility database. But the excuse for omitting hazardous waste emissions from those facilities, treatment, storage, and disposal, or any combination thereof, according to the work group technical memorandum, was the lack of reliability of a single EPA data set. Remedial sites in DEC's database seem to exclude federal radiation sites, such as 2,000 Curies or half the world's radium-226 in Niagara County, and radiation problems at the Tonawanda landfill and others. Last I knew, Senator Schumer had more FUSRAP sites, the Army Corps of Engineers Federal Radiation Program, in his state than any other member of Congress. And then we have the failure of DEC permitting to enforce whatever policies are implemented, biased and otherwise, especially when it comes to environmental justice for incinerator and landfill operations. More than half of New York State's waste is paper and food, according to the pie charts in the climate documents posted. And yet all of the climate change related committees can't seem to figure out how to wean New York off of incinerators between now and 2050, according to the CAC draft plan. EJ stakeholders were provided no technical assistance independent of DEC staff to review a plethora of information that was not concealed or to express concerns about what was concealed in advance of providing these comments or in time for July 7th. I believe DEC's air divisions know where the problems are. All of the Title V, many of the state permit holders, and even some air registrations are for facilities that have provided modeling to DEC. The mobile air sampling should not be done in a vacuum. It should be combined and coordinated with modeling, stack testing, all as reality checks, and to really do a better job of identifying problems in EJ communities. I hope DEC will hire a contractor, put all of these models in a database, and then map the dispersion so that the Climate Justice Working Group and communities can see it, and that we stop permitting smokestacks in isolation of evaluating pre-existing cumulative impacts in any of the EJ communities. Perhaps the best example of the extraordinary disproportionate burden in Niagara County is the 13th largest waste incinerator in the United States in the tiny city of Niagara Falls, which has a higher poverty rate than New York City. The GHG pie charts show 2 categories of waste. One is landfill, the other is simply labeled other. It camouflages the fact that incinerators in this state emit as much GHG as agriculture, but only our farmers are being asked to make significant changes that would impair their competitiveness. Some 30,000 family farms in this state to subsidize the GHG emissions from incinerators outside of New York City that burn waste for the benefit of New York City, and then put 20 to 25% of toxic ash in upstate landfills. No one here opposes investing in New York City to prevent flooding and protect the neediest among us. But what about the rest of New York? There are no maps showing the real extent of existing environmental exposure burdens and no map showing who benefits. Doing so might help promote more equity in this process. Thank you.
Excuse me.
Ms. Wittrell.
Oh, wait a minute. Excuse me. This is a court reporter. Can I get the spelling of your last name, please?
Witryol.
Thank you.
I've called all of our registered speakers, and now I would like to offer for anyone who's joined us that didn't register to speak, to raise your hand if you'd like to make a comment. If we could put the slide back up on the screen on how to raise your hand if you've joined by the internet. If you've joined us by phone and you would like to make a comment and didn't register, if you could please press *3 on your phone, and we'll unmute your line for you to make a comment. On the screen now, for those of you that have joined us by the internet, are the instructions for how to raise your hand. And if you'd like to make a comment here, please follow those directions. And we have one call-in user ending in 16. If we could unmute that line, I'd ask that person to please start by identifying yourself by stating your full name for us and spell your last name. We had a line unmuted, but I think we lost the line. Okay, we have the caller ending in 16. If we could unmute that line again. Okay, could you please
hear me?
begin by stating your full name and spell your last name for us?
My name is David Gilmore, Gilmour. Good afternoon, and I'm a urban planner representing the village of Curious Joel in Orange County. On behalf of the village, I thank the Climate Justice Working Group for the opportunity to provide testimony relative to the draft disadvantaged communities criteria. We reflected on the draft criteria and respectfully offer input based on many years of our clients' experience as a very disadvantaged community. Curious Joel is populated by Satmar Hasidic Jews, and most of the community speak Yiddish and are non-English speaking. The village is densely populated with 32,000 residents residing within 1.4 square miles. The majority of residents are disadvantaged by poverty, language barriers, educational attainment, and access to work. Most importantly, nearly 60% of the population are children, and more than half of the children live at or below the poverty line. Written testimony from Curious Joel will be submitted. At this time, I will present a summary of requests. As you can imagine, when a community has nearly 60% of population as children, and when those children live in poverty, the vulnerabilities and burdens are substantial. The DAC criteria would be enhanced by adding a measure of percentage of children similar to that included for those over 65, and another indicator for childhood poverty. Next bullet, the draft DAC included a limited English proficiency indicator. This is such a significant barrier to moving out of poverty, we recommend it be assigned a weight of 2, similar to the poverty indicator. We recommend including 0 vehicle household as an indicator. Not only is it a strong measure of disadvantage, but more importantly, it is central to framing climate change and energy efficiency policy, particularly in communities with limited public transit. Next bullet, we suggest adding a measure of community dependency, such as on public assistance. Dependency is not the same as poverty. External dependency for food and energy with increasing costs impacted by climate change threaten the long-term viability of New York State's continuum of safety net benefits used to provide families access to basic necessities. Next bullet, we recommend adding indicators reflecting population density. Living primarily in apartments and buildings with crowded living quarters, these communities are at great risk from droughts, extreme weather, heat vulnerability, worker impacts, and reduced productivity. Such communities have less capacity to respond and recover with limited means to evacuate and find alternate shelter. Buildings contribute approximately 40% to greenhouse gas emissions, and apartment buildings are typically older, less efficient, and to the health hazards from the fossil fuel pollutants. Next bullet, we
Mr.
recommend
Gilmore.
applying a weighting. Yes.
Mr. Gilmore, I'm just going to say, since you've indicated you're going to submit your longer comments in writing, I'm going to ask you to wrap up now because I do have some other people who have raised their hands to make their comments. Thank you.
Okay, and did I use up the time allotted?
Yes. But go ahead, I'll let you wrap up.
We recommend applying a weighting of 2 to the premature death indicator because it's a known impactor of impacts to population and health and environmental vulnerabilities. We offer that the DAC criteria should include a measure of the community's financial capacity to meet its water, sewer, transport infrastructure needs. It's recommended a vehicle miles traveled per capita variable. And finally, our community is homogeneous, and while 2 of our census tracts qualify as disadvantaged under the draft criteria, 2 do not. We look forward to continuing to work together to ensure Curious Joel's unique and underserved population can seek assistance community-wide. Thanks for this opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Mr. Gilmore. Our next raised hand is Douglas Champ. If Mr. Champ could be unmuted, we'll let him begin his comments. Go ahead, sir. Mr. Champ, you've been unmuted. Oh, you
Thank
were
you.
unmuted. Go
Okay,
ahead.
I just want to clarify, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm a former utility manager on all types of energy issues, primarily thermal development. And I've spoken all over the country in years past about community energy systems. The real problem associated with what you're launching here is the criteria of costs in terms of conversion of electrification in tracts, numeration districts that are very well associated with poverty. Now, specifically, the muni systems in the state of New York are not eligible because they do not pay system benefit charges. Therefore, under the NYSERDA current formula for allowing perhaps uses of variations of how buildings can be converted, especially in low income areas that are identified across Western New York, the cost to electrify these individual houses going from a combined energy use of natural fuel versus electric and going all electric when the systems that they have. Now, remember, we have infrastructure inside houses and we have it delivered to us for the infrastructure outside. The conversion cost of any of these older homes, many of them built before 1940, are not in a position to afford any electrification whatsoever. If you were to convert a home wherever it is under these criteria, you might be looking at $25,000 or more of people who don't have enough money sometimes to pay their utility bill. So how are you going to handle electric transfer and conversion over to the residential community that is impoverished and unable to benefit from the existing NYSERDA programs because eligibility is established by system benefit charges? So are you going to make available to the municipality utilities that can't take advantage of these programs an opportunity to help finance these conversions from fossil to electric? That's my question, and I want to make sure you understand what I'm trying to tell you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Champ. Mr. Champ, I'd ask you to press the hand icon again to lower your hand. And Mr. Gilmore, I'd ask you to press *3 on your phone again to lower your hand. And at this time, I'd welcome anyone else who would like to raise their hand to make a comment. If you've joined us by phone again, if you would like to make a comment, please raise your hand by pressing *3 on your phone. And if you've joined us by the internet, the instructions for raising your hand are on the screen. Anyone else would like to make a comment here before we conclude the hearing, please raise your hand and we'll unmute your line. Again, if you've joined by phone, please press *3 on your phone. Otherwise, the instructions are on the screen to raise your hand. We have a raised hand from Jacqueline Drescher, Drechtsler. If we could unmute that line, please. Go ahead.
I've been on several different calls with the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council and the National Advisory Council, and I've been to a lot of the meetings that the DEC held initially starting about a year ago regarding disadvantaged communities. So I'm going to talk briefly about disadvantaged communities and our energy supply. So what I'd like to say is that clean energy and energy efficiencies will go out the window when RECs are going to be available to developers and building owners from Champlain Hudson Power Express and Clean Path New York. Champlain Hudson Power Express is a hydro project coming from Canada. Instead of actually doing the work, they will get credit for not doing the work to move New York State forward as a leader in climate change action. Furthermore, in the case of Chippy, which is touted to bring, quote, clean, end quote, energy to New York City area, Hydro-Quebec hydropower not only creates a great amounts of greenhouse gas emissions that are not counted, but will not be supplying energy during winter peak times. Actually, they will be running out of hydro energy and will not even be able to supply their own customers in Canada by 2027. Because of this, it is very likely that peaker plants will be put back into action in the very disadvantaged communities in the New York City area that you are trying to help. Then there are the other disadvantaged communities in upstate New York, which will be bearing the financial brunt of the Hydro-Quebec supply into New York City. And two of the commissioners at the Public Service Commission were really trying to bring that to the attention of everyone. I also would like to say that Indigenous First Nations in Canada, where this hydro energy is produced, have been and are being seriously harmed from hydropower plants, which emit large amounts of greenhouse gases and methyl mercury built on their lands without their permission or compensation. We need to take into account the harms that we create for others because of our own energy needs, whether it's in state, out of state, or out of our country. So thank you very much. I appreciate everything that this council is doing. And I do hope that the definition of disadvantaged communities can be expanded. And also that there may be an extension for people to really wrap their heads around this, because as someone said earlier, there has not been a lot of outreach unless you're already kind of a climate activist. So there needs to be better outreach to the communities that are impacted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Dressler. Is there anyone else who would like to make a comment today? If you've joined by phone, please press *3 on your phone. If you've joined by the internet, there's a small hand icon on your screen. You can click on that hand icon to raise your hand and we'll know to unmute your line. Anyone else who's joined us today that would like to make a comment, please raise your hand. And again, if you've joined by phone, you can press *3 on your telephone to raise your hand. And if you've joined us by the internet, the slide on the screen has the instructions for how to do that. If there's anyone else that would like to make a comment, please raise your hand at this time. Okay, I'll note that at this time, I do not have any other raised hands. This is a last call. If anyone else would like to make a comment here today, please raise your hand by pressing *3 on your phone or clicking on the hand icon on your screen. The instructions for how to do that are on the screen right now. Okay, I'll note that no one has raised their hand on behalf of the DEC and NYSERDA. I thank everyone who's joined us here today. This is an important process and we value your comments. We thank you for taking the time to join us today. And please remember that the comment period is until July 7th, 2022. To submit comments in writing, you can submit them by email, daccomments@dec.ny.gov, or written comments by mail to the New York State DEC draft DAC comments, Office of Environmental Justice, 625 Broadway, 14th floor, Albany, New York, 12233. And again, the information is available on the website at climate.ny.gov, climate.ny.gov. Thank you again for joining us today, and we'll stand in recess.
Okay, I have us off the record.